The eyes of a warrior. The early morning air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked pavement and the distant hum of the awakening city. It was the time when the streets were still drowsy, the world caught between the hush of the night and the chaos of the day. The subway rumbled beneath the surface, a steel serpent slithering through the underbelly of the metropolis, its fluorescent lights flickering sporadically as it carried the early commuters toward their destinies. Lance Corporal Ethan Cole sat at the far edge of the subway platform, his back pressed against the cool metal bench, his sharp eyes casually sweeping the near-empty station. Though dressed in civilian clothes, there was no mistaking his military bearing. His rigid posture, the way his shoulders squared even at rest, the steady alertness in his gaze. Some instincts were impossible to turn off, no matter how far one was from the battlefield. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not today. Ethan had been granted a few days' leave after the funeral of his best friend, Corporal Mason Reed, a Marine who had survived the horrors of war but succumbed to the demons in his mind. PTSD, depression, addiction. Words that seemed foreign on the battlefield but followed soldiers home like unseen shadows. The funeral had been a blur of folded flags, mournful salutes, and the aching weight of guilt. Mason had been suffering, and Ethan hadn't seen it in time. The thought sat heavy in his chest, an anvil pressing against his ribs. Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing his mind back to the present. The subway station was quiet, the kind of quiet that made him uneasy. Only a handful of people occupied the platform. An older businessman engrossed in his phone, a janitor mopping the floor with slow, tired movements, and a middle-aged man holding the hand of a little girl. It was the man and the child who caught Ethan's attention. The girl, no older than 6 or 7, wore a neat school uniform with a backpack that seemed far too large for her tiny frame. A stuffed rabbit, its fur worn and well-loved, dangled limply from her grip. Her feet shuffled slightly, an unconscious motion of unease. Ethan's gaze shifted to the man beside her. He was dressed casually, denim jacket, worn jeans, scuffed sneakers. On the surface, nothing seemed out of place. But Ethan had spent too many years reading body language, assessing threats, and detecting anomalies in human behavior. Something wasn't right. The grip on the girl's wrist was too tight, not guiding, but restraining. The way she held herself, stiff, small, as if trying to disappear, set off alarms in Ethan's head. He didn't move, didn't stare too long, but his mind was already running calculations. A nervous child on the first day of school. Possible. A father who didn't know how to handle her nerves. Also possible. But the way she looked around, as if searching for an escape, sent his instincts into overdrive. Ethan shifted his position slightly, standing and walking toward the vending machine at the far end of the platform. He wasn't thirsty, but it gave him an excuse to move closer to listen. The man crouched slightly, his voice adopting a sing-song cadence. "You're excited for your first day, aren't you, sweetheart?" The girl's voice was barely above a whisper. "Ah, yes, Daddy." Ethan's hand froze mid-motion. It wasn't the words that set off alarm bells. It was how she said them. The way Daddy came out unnatural. Forced. Practiced. The businessman nearby scrolled mindlessly on his phone. The janitor mopped without looking up. No one else seemed to notice the wrongness of the moment. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had spent years in war zones, had seen the worst of humanity. But this was different. This was something insidious, hiding in plain sight, and no one else seemed to see it. His fingers hovered over his phone's keypad. He could call it in, make a discreet report, but what would he say? A girl looked scared on the subway. No. He needed more. Instead, he selected the loudest drink option from the vending machine. The metal can dropped with a sharp, echoing clang, loud enough to turn heads, including the man's. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, a flicker of something behind the stranger's carefully controlled expression. Fear, anger, recognition. Ethan had seen that look before, in people who knew they had been caught but weren't sure how to react yet. Ethan cracked open the can and took a slow sip, his gaze shifting between the man and the girl. "Morning," Ethan said casually, giving a polite nod. The man hesitated before returning the nod. "Morning." His grip on the girl's wrist tightened. Subtle, but Ethan saw it. The girl's blue eyes flicked toward him, wide and pleading, before darting back down to the tiled floor. The train's arrival echoed through the tunnel, a gust of wind sweeping through the platform as the doors hissed open. Ethan stepped aside, watching as the man gently tugged the girl toward the nearest door. She hesitated, just for a moment. But it was enough. Everything in Ethan screamed at him to intervene, but he forced himself to stay calm. There was still a chance he was wrong, and if he acted without proof, he could ruin an innocent man's morning and terrify a little girl for no reason. But if he was right, he followed them onto the train. The doors closed, the subway lurching forward as they took their seats. Ethan took a position a few rows behind them, his phone in hand, but his attention locked onto them. He needed to be sure. Then, as if the universe had decided to remove all doubt, a faint whisper broke through the train's dull hum. "Stop. Please stop." Ethan's breath hitched. He looked up. The girl was pulling against the man's grip, her voice barely audible. The man leaned down, whispering something into her ear. She went still, rigid. Her small hands clutched the stuffed rabbit tighter. Ethan didn't hesitate. He rose to his feet, moving toward the door leading to the next car. He kept his pace slow, his stance casual, but inside, his blood boiled. If his instincts were wrong, he'd deal with the consequences. But if they were right, then this train had just become a battlefield. And Ethan Cole never lost on the battlefield. The Predator's mask. The subway car rattled through the tunnels, its flickering lights casting elongated shadows on the floor. The air was thick with the scent of metal, sweat, and something else. Tension. Ethan Cole moved with slow, deliberate steps, keeping his pace measured as he approached the man and the girl. His pulse remained steady, his breathing even, but every fiber of his being was coiled, ready to strike. Years of training had honed his instincts, turning him into a predator of his own kind, a soldier conditioned to read the battlefield, to identify threats before they could act. This wasn't the battlefield, not in the traditional sense, but predators existed everywhere. And this one had chosen the wrong victim. The girl sat stiffly, her tiny hands clenching the straps of her oversized backpack. She wasn't moving, wasn't fidgeting like a child normally would. She was frozen. Her wide blue eyes darted around, but she never made a sound. Ethan had seen that look before. Fear, submission, trapped. The man beside her was no longer trying to appear friendly. His expression had shifted, hardening now that he thought no one was watching. His hand remained locked around the girl's wrist, fingers curled in a possessive grip. It was a controlled grip, one that gave the illusion of casual contact, but was firm enough that she wouldn't dare move. Ethan had seen this before. He knew this grip. A man pretending to be something he wasn't. A mask. A lie. The subway car was mostly empty, save for an elderly woman dozing near the front and a distracted couple locked in conversation. No one else was watching. No one else saw what Ethan saw. The man whispered something under his breath. The girl flinched. That was it. That was all Ethan needed. He stepped closer, leaning against the metal pole near their seats. His stance was casual, but his sharp gaze drilled into the man's profile. Everything all right here. Ethan's voice was light, but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. The man tensed, just for a second. It was subtle, but Ethan caught it. Then, as if flipping a switch, the stranger turned to him with a forced smile. "Oh yeah, she's just nervous. First day of school." He gave a rehearsed chuckle, patting the girl's arm in a fatherly gesture that didn't match his earlier grip. The girl didn't react, didn't smile, didn't look up. Ethan ignored the man and crouched to her level. "Hey, kiddo," he said gently. "What's your name?" The girl's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. She glanced at the man, her breathing shallow. The man's grip tightened ever so slightly, fingers pressing into her skin. Ethan's entire body went rigid. That was a warning, a silent command. The girl looked back down, her stuffed rabbit trembling in her grasp. "She's just shy," the man interjected quickly, flashing a tight smile. "You know how kids are." Ethan's eyes flicked between the two. He had a decision to make. If he acted now, if he pushed too hard, the man might panic. He could bolt, taking the girl with him, disappearing into the depths of the city where no one would ever find her. If Ethan waited, played this carefully, he could gather enough evidence to ensure this man never saw the light of day again. The problem was time. The train would reach its next stop in less than 2 minutes. The doors would open. The predator would have a chance to escape. Ethan took a slow breath, flexing his fingers. He had one shot, and he wasn't going to miss. The reckoning. The train screeched into the station, its automated voice announcing the stop with mechanical indifference. Ethan straightened. The man did too. Their eyes met. He knows. The moment stretched, a quiet war unfolding in a single glance. Then the man moved. Not a full-out sprint. That would attract too much attention. But a calculated, urgent stride, his grip tightening on the girl's arm as he guided her toward the exit. Ethan followed, his pace matching theirs. Not too fast, not too aggressive, but deliberate. The doors slid open. The man stepped forward. Ethan was right behind him. The platform was crowded, businessmen, students, early morning workers. It was the perfect place to vanish. No, not today. Ethan reached out, his hand landing firmly on the man's shoulder. The stranger froze mid-step. "Hey," Ethan said, voice low, steady. "Let her go." The tension in the man's body became palpable. His breathing quickened. He turned, eyes flashing with something between anger and fear. "Excuse me." His voice was defensive, layered with false indignation. Ethan's expression didn't change. "I said, let her go." The man's fingers tightened around the girl's arm. She whimpered. That was enough. Ethan moved. Fast, precise, controlled. His hand snapped to the man's wrist, applying sharp pressure to the tendons. The predator let out a strangled grunt, his grip automatically releasing from the girl. Ethan positioned himself between them in a single motion, his stance firm. The man stumbled back, rubbing his wrist, his face twisted with fury. "You think you're a hero," he spat, voice low but venomous. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Ethan's gaze never wavered. "I know enough." The man glanced around. The crowd was beginning to take notice. Commuters were pausing, watching, phones already in hand. A predator's worst nightmare. Exposure. A beat passed. Then, without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the crowd, his retreating form swallowed by the city. Ethan exhaled slowly, his body still humming with adrenaline. He turned to the girl. She stood frozen, her small hands gripping the stuffed rabbit so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Ethan knelt in front of her, keeping his voice soft. "You're safe now." The girl hesitated. Then, finally, she looked up at him. Her lower lip trembled. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan swallowed, nodding once. "Let's get you home." As he guided her toward the station security, he could still feel the predator's gaze lingering in the shadows. This wasn't over. Not yet. Shadows never rest. The city stretched out before them, a concrete jungle where secrets slithered between the cracks, hiding in alleyways, lurking behind closed doors. Ethan Cole stepped out of the subway station with the little girl, Karina, walking beside him, her small fingers clutching the hem of his sleeve, like it was the only tether keeping her grounded. She hadn't spoken much since they left the platform. Not that Ethan blamed her. He had seen fear before, on battlefields, in the eyes of soldiers staring down death, in the faces of civilians caught in the crossfire. But this was different. This was the kind of fear that wasn't about explosions or bullets. This was the fear of being prey. Karina's tiny frame shivered despite the warmth of the morning sun breaking through the city's smog. They stood at the top of the subway stairs, the hum of life moving around them. People walked past, too caught up in their own worlds to notice the little girl who had just escaped a nightmare. Ethan crouched to her level. "Karina," he said gently. She flinched but looked up at him, her wide blue eyes swimming with something fragile. "You don't have to be scared anymore. I promise." Her fingers tightened around her stuffed rabbit, a tattered thing with one ear half torn, the kind of toy a child never let go of. She licked her lips. But he said he'd come back. Ethan's jaw clenched. There it was, the hook in her mind, the psychological leash that Predator had fastened around her. She didn't just fear the past. She feared what could still happen. "Listen to me." Ethan's voice was steady, the same tone he used when commanding his men. "He's not coming back. Not while I'm here." Karina hesitated. "But what if he won't?" Ethan interrupted. "Because I won't let him." The words landed somewhere deep inside her. She didn't relax completely, but she nodded. A small nod, barely there, but it was a start. "Can I call your mom?" Ethan asked. Karina hesitated again, then nodded again, this time slightly more firm. "Okay." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. "Do you know her number?" She recited it in a quiet voice, and Ethan quickly dialed. The phone rang once, twice. Then, "Hello." The voice was breathless, tinged with worry. "Ma'am, my name is Lance Corporal Ethan Cole. I'm with your daughter, Karina. She's safe." Silence. Then, a sharp inhale. "Karina? Is she okay? Where is she?" "She's right here," Ethan reassured her. "We're outside the 5th Street subway station. I can bring her to you or—" "I'll be there in 5 minutes." The line went dead. Ethan looked at Karina. "Your mom's coming." Something flickered in her expression. Relief. But beneath it, the fear was still there. And Ethan knew. This wasn't over. Not yet. A mother's worst nightmare. 5 minutes felt like an eternity. But soon enough, a woman burst through the subway entrance, her wild eyes scanning the crowd. Karina. Karina let go of Ethan's sleeve and ran. She collided into her mother's arms, the force nearly knocking them both over. Ethan stood back, watching as Jocelyn Peterson, Karina's mother, clutched her daughter to her chest, shaking. Tears streaked down her face as she pressed frantic kisses to Karina's forehead. "Oh, baby, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have." Ethan let them have the moment. He had seen this before too. The desperate relief of finding someone safe after thinking they were lost forever. After a few moments, Jocelyn looked up at him, her dark eyes locked onto his, and she rose to her feet. You're the one, Bo." Ethan nodded. Without warning, she threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Thank you so much." Ethan hesitated. Hugs weren't exactly his thing, but he patted her shoulder lightly. When she pulled back, her face was a mess of tears, exhaustion, and gratitude. "What happened?" she asked, her voice still raw. Ethan exhaled, glancing at Karina before meeting Jocelyn's eyes again. "I think your daughter was almost abducted." The color drained from Jocelyn's face. "What?" Ethan explained everything. What he had seen on the subway, how the man had acted, how Karina had whispered stop but was too afraid to resist. Jocelyn's breathing became ragged. I don't understand." "Who would? Why?" Ethan had asked himself the same thing too many times in his life. Because there were monsters in this world. And not all of them looked like monsters. "They target children," he said grimly. They look for ones who are vulnerable, isolated, and they manipulate them. Jocelyn swallowed hard, clutching Karina tighter. I should have noticed. I should have known. This isn't your fault. Ethan's voice was firm. These people know what they're doing. They know how to make a child trust them. Jocelyn closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. When she opened them again, something else burned there. Determination. What do we do now? She asked. Ethan glanced around. He still felt it. That unease, that presence. Predators never let go of their prey easily. We go somewhere safe, Ethan said. And we call the police. Hunted in the open. The walk back to Jocelyn's apartment felt longer than it should have. Ethan stayed close, scanning every alleyway, every shadow, every person walking too close. Karina stayed pressed against her mother's side, silent. When they reached the apartment, Jocelyn unlocked the door with shaking hands, ushering Karina inside. Ethan stepped in behind them, his senses still on high alert. Sit tight, he told Jocelyn. I'll make the call. She nodded, pulling Karina into the safety of the couch as Ethan stepped into the kitchen, dialing the precinct. A woman's voice answered. 911. What's your emergency? This is Lance Corporal Ethan Cole, he said. I need to report an attempted child abduction. The air was heavy. Ethan turned, glancing through the window blinds. And then he saw it. Across the street, near the alley, a figure, a man in a different jacket, but the same posture, the same presence. He was watching. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. He turned back to the dispatcher. I need officers sent immediately. Because this predator, he wasn't done hunting. And Ethan wasn't done stopping him. The predator's shadow. The weight of the moment pressed against Ethan Cole, like a combat vest strapped too tight. His heartbeat was steady, his muscles coiled, but his mind was already running through tactical scenarios. This wasn't a battlefield, not in the traditional sense, but the enemy was watching. And Ethan had no doubt he was planning his next move. The figure across the street was half hidden in the alleyway, standing just far enough back that casual passersby wouldn't notice him. But Ethan did. The man had changed jackets, swapped his shoes, and ditched the baseball cap he had worn on the subway. A simple but effective disguise swap. One meant to blend in, meant for escape. But Ethan saw him. And the man knew it. Their eyes locked through the slats of the blinds for just a second. Then the predator turned and walked away, slipping deeper into the alley. Ethan pulled the phone closer to his ear. I need those officers here now. The dispatcher's voice remained professional, but he could hear the shift in tone, the recognition that this wasn't just an ordinary report. We're dispatching units to your location, sir, she confirmed. Are you in immediate danger? Ethan's eyes flicked back to Karina and her mother. Not him. Them. No, but the suspect was watching from across the street. He just moved into an alley behind the complex. He's changed clothes to avoid being identified. A pause. Then the woman's voice sharpened. Understood. Stay inside and keep the doors locked. Officers are en route. Ethan ended the call and turned to Jocelyn. She had pulled Karina into her lap, rocking slightly, her grip tight but comforting. Her dark eyes flickered with worry as Ethan stepped back into the living room. What's going on? Ethan didn't sugarcoat it. He was watching from across the street. Jocelyn's face paled. Karina stiffened against her mother. He said he'd come back. Ethan's jaw tightened. He crouched in front of the little girl, keeping his voice steady. Listen to me, Karina. He's not getting near you again. I won't let him. The police are on their way, and he knows he can't do anything now. Okay. Karina's lower lip trembled. Then, slowly, she nodded. Ethan stood and turned to Jocelyn. Do you have extra locks on the door? She nodded and stood, moving to secure the deadbolt, then pulling a metal bar from behind the couch. I have this too, just in case. Good. She wasn't helpless. That made things easier. Ethan glanced around the apartment. The layout was simple. One small entryway leading to a living room, a kitchen tucked into the back, and a short hallway leading to 2 bedrooms. A single window in the living room, another in the kitchen, 2 more in the bedrooms. He checked them all. Locked. Secured. No easy access points. Then he positioned himself near the door, his back against the wall, his ears tuned to the faintest sounds beyond the apartment. Jocelyn hesitated near the couch. "Are you expecting him to come here?" Ethan's expression remained unreadable. "I don't expect anything. I prepare for everything." The hunt begins. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. The police still hadn't arrived. Ethan's instincts gnawed at him. Something wasn't right. Karina had dozed off, curled up against her mother. Jocelyn was wide awake, her hands absently stroking her daughter's hair, but her eyes were locked onto Ethan. "You've done this before," she whispered. Ethan exhaled. "Something like it." She hesitated. "You were in the military." "Still am." Jocelyn nodded slowly, taking that in. "I don't know how to thank you." Ethan shook his head. "Don't. I was just in the right place at the right time." Her eyes darkened. No one else noticed. He didn't answer. Because she was right. How many people had sat on that subway, too wrapped up in their own worlds to see what was happening right in front of them? Too many. A sharp knock at the door pulled Ethan's attention. Jocelyn stiffened. Karina stirred. Ethan motioned for Jocelyn to stay put and approached the door with controlled movements. He glanced through the peephole. 2 uniformed officers. Finally, he opened the door, but only enough to keep a barrier between them. Lance Corporal Ethan Cole. One of the officers, a woman with sharp, no-nonsense eyes, nodded. "Detective Evelyn Harrington, you reported an attempted abduction." Ethan stepped back and let them in. Harrington surveyed the room quickly. "This is the girl." "Yes." Jocelyn sat up, shifting Karina into a more upright position. "She's scared." The second officer, a younger man who looked fresh out of academy training, crouched slightly to meet Karina's eyes. "You're safe now, sweetheart." Ethan's expression remained impassive. "I don't think he's gone." Harrington turned to him. "Explain." Ethan laid it out. The way the man had been watching. The change in clothing. The way he had walked away, not ran. Predators didn't run. They stalked. They waited for another chance. Harrington exchanged a glance with her partner before nodding. "We'll sweep the area." She looked at Jocelyn. "You'll need to come down to the station to give a statement." Jocelyn hesitated. Is that safe?" Harrington's tone was firm. "Safer than here." Ethan agreed. "I'll go with you." Jocelyn's eyes flickered with relief. "Okay." The chase. The ride to the station was uneventful. The police cars' blue and red lights flickered against the darkened streets, but no sirens blared. Karina sat in the back, clutching her rabbit, while Jocelyn rubbed her shoulders. Ethan sat in the front passenger seat beside Harrington. They were only 3 blocks from the station when the radio crackled to life. Unit 412, possible suspect sighted near the victim's residence. Male, late 30s, wearing dark clothing, attempted to evade officers when approached. Ethan's blood ran cold. "Confirmed." Another officer's voice responded. "He just ran into an abandoned lot, requesting backup." Harrington grabbed the radio. "Unit 412 en route." Then, without hesitation, she turned the wheel, making the sharp U-turn. The lights flared. The siren roared to life. Ethan's body was already coiled, ready, because this wasn't just some random suspect. This was him. And this time, he wasn't going to get away. The chase through shadows. The police cruiser roared down the streets, the wail of the siren cutting through the city's hum. Ethan's heart pounded with controlled adrenaline, not the erratic kind that came from fear, but the sharpened edge of preparedness. He had hunted men before. He had been hunted before. This was no different. Except this time, the battlefield wasn't a foreign desert. It was a city. And the enemy was a predator hiding behind a mask of humanity. Harrington gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, as she weaved through traffic, her face a mask of concentration. He ran into an abandoned lot. Ethan asked. "Yeah," she said. "That whole area's under development. Half-finished buildings, open foundations, places to hide." Ethan's jaw clenched. Not for long. In the back seat, Karina whimpered softly. Jocelyn pulled her close, whispering reassurances, but Ethan could feel the weight of her fear pressing against the air itself. She was afraid he'd come back. Afraid he'd take her. Afraid no one could stop him. Ethan tightened his fist. Not a damn chance. The radio crackled again. "Suspect sighted near the fence. He's trying to climb over into the next lot. Moving in now." Harrington cursed under her breath. "If he gets over that fence," she muttered, "he's gone." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Stop the car." Harrington shot him a look. "What?" "Stop the car." She must have seen something in his expression, because she didn't argue. She slammed the brakes, and before the cruiser even fully stopped, Ethan was moving. The hunt ends here. The moment Ethan's boots hit the pavement, he was already sprinting. The world around him blurred. The police cruiser, the flashing lights, the distant sound of Karina crying out. But none of it mattered. Only one thing mattered. Catching him. He rounded the corner, his body moving on instinct, scanning the scene as he ran. There, up ahead, a shadowy figure was scrambling up a rusted chain-link fence, his hands slipping against the metal. Ethan knew that posture. The fear of being caught. The desperation of knowing you were running out of time. Ethan put on a burst of speed. He was closing in, 10 feet away, then 5. He leaped. His hand closed around the man's ankle just as he threw one leg over the top of the fence. A snarl of surprise ripped from the predator's throat as Ethan yanked him back. The two of them hit the ground, hard. Ethan rolled smoothly to his feet while the man scrambled back, eyes wild with something between rage and panic. "You!" The man spat, his chest heaving. Ethan didn't give him the chance to finish. He lunged. The fight was short. He was fast. Ethan was faster. The man swung wildly, but Ethan dodged with practiced precision, sidestepping before driving a brutal elbow into his gut. The air whooshed out of the predator's lungs, and before he could react, Ethan pinned him to the pavement, his knee pressing hard against his spine. A sharp grunt of pain escaped the man's lips. Ethan leaned in close, his voice low and dangerous. "You're done." The flashing glow of police lights painted the buildings around them. Heavy boots pounded against the pavement as Harrington and the other officers arrived. The predator squirmed beneath Ethan's grip, but it was over. Handcuffs snapped into place. The weight of years of hunting children was now shackled in cold steel. Harrington hauled the man to his feet. "Name," she demanded. The man stayed silent, his face twisted with fury. But Ethan saw something else beneath that anger. Fear. The kind of fear that came from knowing he had lost. Harrington let out a satisfied breath. "Guess it doesn't matter. We'll find out who you are soon enough." Another officer took over, hauling the suspect toward the waiting patrol car. Ethan exhaled, rolling his shoulders as the rush of adrenaline began to fade. Then he turned. Karina and Jocelyn were standing on the sidewalk, eyes wide as they watched. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Karina ran. Not away. To him. She crashed into his legs, her tiny arms wrapping around him in a desperate hug. "You caught him," she whispered against his knee. Ethan crouched, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. "I told you I would." Karina sniffled. He's not coming back." Ethan met her wide, tear-filled eyes and said the only thing she needed to hear. Never. The beginning of the end. The aftermath was a blur. The suspect was taken into custody. Officers flooded the scene, collecting statements, securing evidence. Jocelyn was shaking when she approached Ethan. I don't know how to thank you. Ethan shook his head. You don't have to. She swallowed, glancing at Karina, who still wouldn't let go of Ethan's sleeve. I thought I lost her, she whispered. I thought. Ethan placed a hand on her shoulder, steady and sure. You didn't. She's here, and she's safe. Jocelyn nodded rapidly, trying to keep her emotions in check. Harrington approached, arms crossed. Well, she said, that was some Marine-level insanity, but I can't say I'm not impressed. Ethan smirked slightly. You're welcome. She exhaled, her expression softening. We've got this now. You did your part. Ethan glanced down at Karina, then back up at Harrington. Not yet, he said. I'll see this through. Harrington studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, she said. Then let's make sure this bastard never sees daylight again. As the police cars pulled away and the city resumed its endless motion, Ethan Cole stood there, watching over Karina and her mother. Because even though the hunt was over, his job wasn't done. Not yet. The long shadow of evil. The police precinct was colder than Ethan expected. Not in temperature, but in atmosphere. The stark white walls, the dim flickering bulbs, and the distant voices echoing down the corridors gave it a heavy, suffocating feel. He had spent time in places like this before, debriefing rooms, holding cells, command posts, but this was different. This wasn't about war. This was about justice. And for Karina, justice had to be swift. Ethan sat across from Detective Evelyn Harrington in one of the precinct's smaller interview rooms. The air smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork. His muscles still hummed with the remnants of adrenaline, but his mind was focused, razor sharp. The man he had tackled, Victor Salgado, was in custody. Now, they had to make sure he stayed there. Harrington flipped through a thick file, her face unreadable. This guy's been at it for years, she muttered, shaking her head. Multiple aliases, multiple locations. We've had reports of an unknown man frequenting elementary schools, playgrounds, and train stations, but he never got close enough for us to pin anything on him. Ethan clenched his jaw. Predators knew how to stay in the shadows. Harrington glanced up at him. You did more than just stop an abduction today, Cole. You may have just blown the lid off an entire operation. Ethan didn't look surprised. He had felt it in his gut from the moment he saw Salgado watching Karina. This wasn't random. This wasn't just one little girl. Salgado had been hunting for a long time. Harrington slid a stack of papers toward Ethan. We pulled footage from traffic cameras, station security, and businesses around the area. This guy has been following a pattern, watching kids, learning routines. He never takes risks. Not unless he's sure. Ethan exhaled slowly. Then why today? Harrington's eyes darkened. Because he thought Karina was isolated. Jocelyn's long work hours, the subway route, the moments when Karina was alone, waiting. Salgado had been watching. And if Ethan hadn't been on that train, he didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. The door swung open, and a uniformed officer stepped in. Detective, the suspect's lawyer is here. Harrington scoffed. Of course he is. Ethan leaned forward. He's already lawyered up. Harrington nodded. These guys always have connections, but we've got enough to hold him. He was caught in the act. She stood, stretching her shoulders before grabbing the case file. I'm going in to interrogate him. You coming? Ethan didn't hesitate. Absolutely. A predator in chains. The interrogation room was small, the kind of place designed to make people uncomfortable. Victor Salgado sat at the metal table, his wrists shackled in handcuffs, his demeanor eerily calm. He wore a blank expression, his eyes studying the scratched surface of the table, as if this were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. His lawyer sat beside him, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit, checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. Harrington and Ethan entered, taking their seats across from them. Harrington wasted no time. Victor Salgado. She let the name hang in the air. You've been a busy man. Salgado smirked. I don't know what you're talking about. Ethan remained silent, watching. Predators like to play games. Harrington placed the case file on the table. Security footage, witness statements, attempted abduction. You ran. You fought. You lost. So, let's cut the act. Salgado shrugged. I was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Ethan's patience snapped. He leaned forward, his voice dangerously low. You targeted a little girl. You stalked her. You planned to take her. And you think you can sit here and smirk. Salgado's expression flickered for the briefest moment. Then he smiled. That little brat. She's not even the one I wanted. Joseline's scream would have shattered the room if she had been there to hear it. Ethan's fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles cracked. Harrington barely glanced at him. Careful what you say, Salgado. Because everything you admit to here only adds time to your sentence. Salgado chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Time. He turned his gaze to Ethan. I've been doing this for years. I'll be out before you know it. Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. The arrogance, the certainty, the lack of fear. He wanted to wipe that smirk off his face. He wanted justice. But he needed something more. He needed to know who else was involved. Ethan exhaled slowly. Control. Precision. Focus. You've been doing this for years. Ethan repeated, his voice measured. Who else is working with you? Salgado's smirk returned. Now, why would I tell you that? Ethan's eyes burned into him. Because you're not getting out of this one, Salgado. The only choice you have left is how much you want to suffer before you rot in prison. Salgado's lawyer finally spoke. That's enough. Harrington sighed, leaning back. You're right. This is getting us nowhere. She tapped the file. We'll let the evidence do the talking. The lawyer stood, straightening his tie. We'll see you in court. As the two of them were escorted out, Ethan stood, his jaw tight. He's not scared, he muttered. Harrington nodded grimly. Because he thinks he has protection. Ethan's stomach twisted. This wasn't just one predator. This was bigger, and he wasn't stopping until he tore it all down. Home, but not safe. Hours later, Ethan stood outside Joseline's apartment, watching the street. The police had promised security, but he knew better. Joseline opened the door, her expression tired but grateful. Come in. Ethan stepped inside. Karina was curled up on the couch, hugging her rabbit. Ethan sat beside her. Hey, kiddo. She looked up at him with tired, wary eyes. Is he gone? Ethan nodded. Yeah, he's gone. She hesitated. For good. Ethan swallowed. I'm working on that. Karina reached out and grabbed his sleeve, her small fingers twisting into the fabric. Don't let him come back. Ethan met her gaze. Serious. Strong. Brave. I won't. And he meant it. But deep down, Ethan knew. Salgado was just the beginning. And the real war was only starting. The war in the shadows. The city stretched endlessly beyond Joseline's apartment window, a maze of lights and movement, but Ethan Cole wasn't looking at the skyline. He was staring into the darkness, his sharp eyes scanning the empty street below, waiting, watching. Somewhere out there, monsters like Salgado still roamed free, and Ethan wasn't done hunting them. Behind him, the apartment was quiet except for the rhythmic breathing of Joseline and Karina. The little girl had finally fallen asleep after hours of whispered reassurances, her tiny body curled up on the couch, the well-loved stuffed rabbit still clutched in her grasp. Joseline had insisted on staying up, but exhaustion had eventually claimed her too. She lay in the armchair, arms crossed over her chest, face tight even in sleep. Ethan knew what that was. A mother's fear didn't disappear just because the nightmare was over. Because deep down she knew. It wasn't over. The man they had caught, Victor Salgado, had acted too sure of himself, too arrogant. And men like him didn't work alone. Ethan leaned against the wall, his muscles tense. His mind ran through the last few hours, dissecting every word Salgado had said, every calculated smirk, every careless slip of the tongue. That little brat, she's not even the one I wanted. That line had stayed with him. What did he mean? Salgado had been watching Karina for weeks. He had chosen his moment, tested the waters, and nearly succeeded. But the way he had said it, like she was just one option of many, made Ethan's skin crawl. How many others were out there? His phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it from his pocket, seeing a message from Detective Harrington. "Harrington, we need to talk. Now." Ethan's stomach tightened. He grabbed his jacket and turned to Jocelyn. She stirred slightly as he pulled the blanket over Karina. "Where are you going?" she murmured sleepily, her voice groggy with exhaustion. "Just meeting with the detective," Ethan said. Jocelyn sat up, blinking. "Is something wrong?" Ethan hesitated. Yes, something was very wrong. But he didn't want to say that. Not yet. "Just some follow-up questions," he said instead. "Lock the door behind me. I won't be long." Jocelyn nodded, but her eyes followed him to the door, worry etched into her features. Ethan stepped out into the night, his instincts on high alert. Something was coming, and he was walking straight into it. The web unravels. The precinct was buzzing when Ethan arrived. Officers moved through the hallways with purpose, low murmurs of conversation filling the air. Harrington was waiting for him just outside the main conference room. She didn't waste time. "We have a problem," she said, motioning for him to follow. Ethan fell into step beside her. "What kind of problem?" Harrington exhaled, her jaw tight. "We pulled Salgado's phone records. There's something off." Ethan arched a brow. Define off. Harrington opened the door to the conference room. The table was covered with printed phone logs, surveillance images, and crime scene reports. A younger officer stood in the corner, typing furiously on a laptop. Harrington pointed at one of the documents. Salgado wasn't working alone. Ethan's jaw clenched. He had suspected as much, but seeing the evidence laid out in front of him made it feel more real. The officer at the laptop spoke up. "We traced multiple outgoing calls from Salgado's burner phone over the past 6 weeks. The same number pops up again and again." Ethan frowned. "Who does it belong to?" The officer hesitated before flipping the laptop around. A name appeared on the screen. Luis Navarro. Ethan didn't recognize it, but Harrington did. Her expression darkened. "Navarro is worse than Salgado. He doesn't just take kids, he moves them." A cold chill ran through Ethan's spine. "Trafficking?" he asked. Harrington nodded grimly. "We've suspected him for years, but he's slippery. Every time we get close, he vanishes." She gestured at the phone logs. Salgado called him 5 times in the last 2 weeks. And get this, he made a call right before he got caught. Ethan's stomach dropped. That meant Navarro knew. And if Navarro knew, then he wouldn't just sit back and wait. He'd be covering his tracks. Or worse, he'd be looking for a new target. Ethan's mind raced. "Do we have an address?" Harrington motioned to the laptop screen. A known alias, a last known location. A storage facility on the outskirts of the city. Ethan's fingers twitched. "We need to move. Now." Harrington exhaled. "We don't have enough for a warrant." Ethan scoffed. "You think Navarro's just gonna sit there and wait while we get one?" Harrington hesitated. Then she grabbed her keys. "Fine, but if this goes sideways, I'm blaming you." Ethan smirked. "Wouldn't have it any other way." Into the lion's den. The drive to the storage facility was silent. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his mind working through possibilities. Navarro was smarter than Salgado, more organized, more dangerous. If they caught him, they wouldn't just be stopping one predator. They could be stopping an entire network. Harrington parked just outside the facility. It was an old industrial lot, the kind of place where secrets were meant to stay buried. Dim lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows over the endless rows of storage units. Ethan scanned the area. Which one is his? Harrington checked her notes. Unit 237. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt. Let's go. They moved fast and quiet, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. When they reached Unit 237, Ethan pressed himself against the metal wall, listening. Nothing. Harrington tried the lock. It was open. Ethan's stomach turned. That was never a good sign. They exchanged a glance. Then, together, they pushed the door open. The horrors inside. The smell hit them first. Not rot. Chemicals. Bleach. A cleanup. The storage unit was nearly empty, except for the single chair in the center of the room, the frayed rope still tied to its arms. Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't a storage unit. This was a holding cell. Harrington cursed under her breath. Damn it. Ethan crouched, his fingers running along the ground. The dust had been disturbed recently. Someone had been here. Maybe hours ago. Maybe minutes. His gaze flicked to the far wall. Scratches, barely visible in the dim light. He moved closer. Help me. The words had been scratched into the metal. Ethan exhaled slowly, his fists tightening. Navarro had been here. And someone, some child, had been here too. But now, they were gone. Harrington's phone rang. She answered, her face growing paler by the second. When she hung up, she turned to Ethan. They found another phone. The last outgoing call. Ethan waited. Harrington's voice was grim. Joseline's number. Ethan's stomach dropped. He didn't think. Didn't hesitate. He was already running. Because this wasn't over. Navarro was coming for Karina, and Ethan was the only one who could stop him. The final hunt. Ethan didn't remember the exact moment he started running. 1 second, he was standing in the cold, sterile storage unit, staring at the chilling message carved into the wall. The next, his boots were pounding against the pavement, his pulse thundering in his ears. Joseline's number. Navarro had called her. That meant one thing. He was going after Karina. Harrington was right behind him, cursing as she fumbled with her phone, calling for backup. We need units at 146th and Ashmore. Suspect is en route to the victim's residence. Possible abduction attempt in progress. Ethan barely heard her. He was already yanking open the car door, slamming himself into the passenger seat. Drive. Harrington didn't question it. The tires screeched as she floored the gas pedal, weaving through the late-night traffic, sirens blaring. The city blurred past, but Ethan only had one image in his head. Karina, asleep on that couch, her small hands clutching that stuffed rabbit. Navarro wasn't just another low-life predator. He was an organizer, a trafficker, a man who didn't just hunt, he sold his prey. If he got his hands on Karina. No, that wasn't happening. Not tonight. Not ever. Joseline's apartment. A mother's fear. Joseline was jolted awake by the harsh knock at her door. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Then came the second knock, louder, more forceful. Karina stirred on the couch, blinking groggily. Mama. Joseline's breath caught in her throat. Something felt wrong. Her instincts screamed at her. She got up quietly, pressing a finger to her lips to signal Karina to stay still. Slowly, she approached the door, peering through the peephole. A man stood outside. Not a uniformed officer. Not Ethan. A stranger. Her stomach twisted into knots. Then the voice came. Low. Calm. Deceptive. Ma'am, this is Officer Daniels with the local precinct. We need to ask you a few questions regarding tonight's events. Joseline froze. Something was off. No badge visible. No police car outside. Her fingers hovered over the lock. Then she took a step back. No. The knock came again, harder this time. Impatient. "Ma'am, I need you to open the door. Now." Joseline's heart slammed against her ribs. No, no, no. She turned and ran. Straight to Karina, grabbing her, pulling her off the couch. "Shea, baby, come with me." Karina whimpered but didn't fight. Joseline grabbed her phone with one hand and the metal bar she kept by the couch with the other. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she would fight. No one was taking her daughter. Not tonight. Not ever. The arrival. A race against time. The moment Harrington screeched into the apartment complex's parking lot, Ethan was out of the car, sprinting toward the entrance. The wrongness of the situation hit him immediately. The lights in Joseline's apartment were still on, but the door, slightly open. Ethan didn't stop. He slammed his shoulder into the door, sending it flying inward, and what he saw nearly made his blood boil. Navarro stood in the middle of the room, his back to Ethan. Joseline was backed against the wall, shielding Karina, the metal bar raised in her trembling hands, and Navarro was smiling. "Come on now," Navarro said smoothly. "No need to make this harder than it has to be." Then he turned his head slightly, just enough to notice the movement behind him. Too late. Ethan launched himself forward. Navarro had no time to react. The force of Ethan's tackle sent them both crashing into the table, shattering glass and knocking over furniture. Navarro fought. He was strong, trained, but Ethan was faster. He drove a fist into Navarro's ribs, followed by a brutal elbow to his jaw. The trafficker reeled, staggering back, then drew a knife. The glint of metal was all the warning Ethan needed. Navarro slashed, aiming for Ethan's throat. Ethan dodged, grabbed his wrist, twisted. Snap! Navarro screamed as his wrist broke, the knife clattering to the floor. Then Ethan grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. The rage inside him burned white-hot. "You think you can just take them?" Ethan growled, "like they're nothing." Navarro spat blood, sneering. "You're too late. It doesn't end with me." Ethan's vision narrowed. For a brief moment, he considered it, ending him. But then he felt Karina's eyes on him, and he let go. This wasn't his justice to deliver. He turned just as Harrington stormed in, her gun drawn, hands where I can see them. Navarro didn't move. He was done. Cuffed, arrested, hauled away. It was over. And Karina. She ran straight into Ethan's arms. "You saved me," she whispered. Ethan knelt, holding her tight. Always. Aftermath. A new beginning. The courtroom was packed. Ethan sat in the back, his posture straight, his uniform crisp. The verdict was delivered. Guilty. On all counts. Joseline sobbed quietly, clutching Karina. Ethan exhaled. It was done. Navarro and Salgado weren't getting out. And the network? It was falling apart. One by one, names were being uncovered. Arrests were being made. Because monsters didn't just live in dark alleys. They lived in plain sight. And today, light had found them. Epilogue. The last goodbye. Outside the courthouse, Karina tugged at Ethan's sleeve. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Ethan smiled, ruffling her hair. "Of course, kiddo." She beamed. "Can I write you letters?" Ethan chuckled. "I'd like that." Joseline wiped her eyes, smiling. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." He nodded. "Take care of her." "I will." As they walked away, hand in hand, Ethan let out a slow breath. The world wasn't perfect. There were still monsters out there. But for Karina, for this little girl, the nightmare was over. And that was enough.